Wednesday, 15th of September, 7 of Britain's top political scientists took part in a debate to mark the launch of the Hansard Society's new book, Britain Votes 2010. The book's co-editors, Professor Andrew Geddes and Professor Jonathan Tong, discussed the outcome of this year's general election, with contributions from Professor John Curtis, Professor Stephen Fielding, Dr Jane Green, Dr Andrew Russell and Dr Ruth Fox.
And the kind of questions which I think we would like to focus on tonight are the big questions that arise from the election. Why did Labour lose? We know that Labour lost 5 million votes between 1997 and 2010. We know that in 2010 the skilled working class abandoned New Labour in droves. And we know too that the middle class swing to the Conservatives was arguably not on the scale that might have been expected and not on the scale that the Conservative Party had hoped for. We argue in the book that Gordon Brown as Prime Minister did nothing to avert and seemingly worsened the decline of Labour. But that decline began before he took office in 2007, and that's one of the themes that we develop in the book and amongst a theme we'd like to develop in our discussion this evening. We talked too about the effects of 13 years of Labour in government. What did they achieve and where next? Particularly with dividing lines about the size, the role, the shape of the state in the light of the budget deficit and cuts. What we also want to do, and obviously what there'll be scope for members of the audience to interact with the panellists, to engage, and we hope to both kind of inform but also stimulate and provoke questions from the audience. And we want to talk about also for the Conservative Party, but the big question as we see it is, what does the partial victory of the Conservative Party tell us about the contemporary Conservative Party? Have they recovered the ground lost in the 1990s? Have they managed, as it's sometimes put, to detoxify the Conservative brand? And Jane Green, in her chapter, talks about the kind of thermometer, the public thermometer, which she sees as moving from cold to warm for the Conservatives as part of this partial recovery. We think in the book too, and we'd be very interested in thoughts and observations about the big society, which we think struggled to impact during the election campaign itself. Can it really be achieved? What are the potential implications for state provision of this big idea, which didn't seem to resonate during the campaign, but seems to be an important theme for the coalition government? We also asked, where now for the Liberal Democrats? They began the campaign fearing a two-party squeeze. And then at one point, as we all know, they seemed to have a chance of dislodging Labour as a second party, at least in terms of the share of the vote. But they ended up taking a step back from their very strong 2005 performance. And Andrew Russell from the University of Manchester, who wrote the chapter on the Liberal Democrats for the book, will talk about that and will show a relatively soft basis of Liberal Democrat support. There has been significant electoral growth of Liberal Democrats, but the party continues to lack a distinctive social base. The book also highlights the soft nature of Cleggmania, as it became known, amid a kind of near hysteria. We see that actually when it came to evaluations by the public of who appeared most prime ministerial leader debates, Clegg trailed third. And we think it's very important to think about that, and also maybe to think about TV debates themselves and the implications of those. They're covered in the book. They may be themes that interest you as members of the audience, and which our panellists will touch upon. We think also that one of the key themes the book focuses on is the electoral system itself, and Professor Curtis is going to look very closely at the functioning of the electoral system. Is it fit for purpose? The book itself shows the fragmentation of the electoral system. The book asks whether it can any longer deliver single-party majoritarian government, and is sceptical of that. And we think too that we need to fundamentally revise some of our expectations about the operation of the British electoral system and the majoritarian rules of the game that have become so familiar over time, but have been seriously questioned by the 2010 election and its outcome. What I'm now going to do is hand over to my co-editor from the University of Liverpool and also president of the Political Studies Association, Professor John Tong, and he's going to pick up some of the other themes that we try to cover in the book as a way of showing what we hope is a rich and full analysis of the 2010 election.
Thank you very much, Andrew. There are several themes within this book, and the first and perhaps most obvious starting point is an evaluation of the health of the political system as a whole, because it provided a rather dark, grim, sinister background to the election itself. First of all, you had the allegations of cash for honours, and then, of course, we had what simply became known as the expenses scandal. And what we try and do is look at the impact of the expenses scandal. Our, admittedly, perhaps early analysis of the impact of the expenses scandal is that it didn't make as much difference as one might expect, certainly in terms of which MPs were returned and who wasn't. If you look actually at the incumbents, if you look at the performance of incumbent MPs relative to non-incumbents who were elected, you don't see that much of a difference in performance at all. But nonetheless, there was a mood of anti-politics prior to the election. And that was going to be reflected potentially in two things. One was a growth in political support for the others, who were polling at a record level in the run-up to the election, at 11% overall. The others, potentially, the minor parties, could have had major breakthroughs at this election. In the end, they returned a figure of only around 8%. The other issue, of course, was turnout. The assumption was going to be that turnout would rise slightly at this election as a consequence of it going to be a close contest. We should not interpret a slight rise in turnout as a reinvigoration of the health of our democracy. The queues, and I was one of those people who was queuing at a polling station on election day for the first time in my life, the queues were entirely due to incompetence and not due to the reinvigoration of our democracy. Let's just put one figure, should put this in context. Look at the prize here of a free book. The highest turnout of the 2010 election in terms of constituency. What was it? Anyone know the constituency? It's in the book, yeah. East Renfrewshire at 77.3%. That's the highest turnout of any constituency. That's marginally lower as a turnout than the average turnout at the 1992 general election. So it seems we all have an awful long way to travel in terms of getting election turnouts into the high upper echelons of the 70%, which is where really it needs to be. I'm going to say this is a proper health check, this is a healthy barometer of political engagement. The second theme that we discuss is the novelty of the TV debates. As Andrew has indicated, people tended to concentrate perhaps too much on who won that debate. That helped sell newspapers in the sense that their job was to report who won that particular debate. They could give a snapshot verdict of the election. It helped sell the following morning's newspapers. But that wasn't really the issue. We should have looked deeper. As has been indicated, Nick Clegg trailed Gordon Brown, let alone David Cameron, in each of those three debates at an average of only 20%, thinking that he was more prime ministerial than the other two candidates. But instead we tended to concentrate on the headline of who actually won that debate. What we try and examine in the book as well is to what extent those TV debates actually affected the election outcome. Did the TV debates turn people away from Gordon Brown even more? Was it the TV debates that somehow influenced the fact that it was the skilled working class and not the desertion of the middle class actually that cost Labour this election? If you look at where Labour's support fell most, it wasn't amongst the middle class deserting Labour in droves. As the book highlights, there was an 18% fall in Labour's vote amongst skilled manual workers. That's where Labour lost the election. There was also a 17% fall in Labour's vote amongst Sun readers. What's amazed me since the election is how modest the Sun has been, not claiming that it was the Sun what won it. But it was a 17% fall in Labour's support amongst Sun readers. Another theme that we looked at in the book is, of course, the nature of coalition politics, and Ruth Fox has a very important contribution within the book to that, analysing what happened in those momentous 5 days after the election. And what's striking about the campaign, and I was as guilty as anyone, as part of the so-called commentary out on News 24 or whatever, is there wasn't a serious discussion over what a coalition might comprise. There were many of us going around saying our PR will be a deal breaker, it'll be 1974 all over again. We tended to rule out the idea of a formal coalition, even though all the opinion poll evidence suggested there was going to be a hung parliament and some sort of deal would be necessary. I think the assumption was that you couldn't bring together a formal coalition in British politics, that it would, perhaps the Lib Dems might support the Conservatives on a bill-by-bill basis. There was actually very little discussion of what a coalition government might look like during the campaign. And the book attempts to address why, and then looks at how the coalition was formed. Two final issues that the book covers in some detail. Immigration featured in every leadership debate. It was the only topic that came up consistently in every leadership debate. Around 5.6 million people moved to the United Kingdom during the last decade. It was a scene of some of the most heated parts. It was the topic of the most heated debates in many ways, particularly between Nick Clegg and David Cameron, over the Liberal Democrats' regional immigration policy and the party's supposed amnesty. The key point of this election, we argue in the book, is the Conservatives learned to speak a lot less about immigration compared to 2005 and indeed to 2001. And what we argue is the Rochdale incident said a lot more about Gordon Brown than it said about immigration. After all, Labour won Rochdale. The final element of the book, in terms of coverage of themes, is the concept of the disunited kingdom. In Scotland, Gordon Brown consistently had a positive rating. YouGov's final poll, in terms of do you like or dislike Gordon Brown, showed positive ratings for Gordon Brown. That was a theme throughout the election in Scotland. Gordon Brown was liked, the Labour Party was liked, there was a swing to the Labour Party in Scotland, there was a swing against the Liberal Democrats in Scotland. The Liberal Democrats had, of course, got rid of two Scottish leaders within a very short space of time in the run-up to the election. Scotland, completely different pattern. Wales, the Conservatives did make gains, but Wales remains essentially Labour. And David Cameron's ill-advised, in many ways, attempt to reintegrate Northern Ireland into the UK party system was palpably an abject failure. The rather bizarre alliance with the Ulster Unionist Party, backing the wrong horse in a two-horse race within unionism, clearly backfired. It led to the loss of the only Ulster Unionist Party Member of Parliament, Lady Sylvia Herman, who stood as an independent in the contest and comprehensively defeated the Unionist candidate, the Ulster Unionist Party candidate. And that does raise questions over what happens in terms of Northern Ireland now. Can it ever be integrated within a UK party system, or will it remain very much a place apart? So that's just to highlight some of the key themes. I'm delighted now to introduce Professor John Curtice, who will be a familiar face to all of you avid followers of British elections. He's been working as part of the BBC's election coverage since way back 1979, and he's the genius who, for the last two elections, has produced almost the exact result, in fact the exact result at the last election in terms of the exit poll. Conservatives 307, Labour 255, Liberal Democrats 57. Go on, who gasped when the Liberal Democrat predicted score of 57 came up on your screens with the exit poll? John Curtice and his team, very able team, with the people who brought you that very, very accurate exit poll, that all-important exit poll. John's produced a number of books over the years, a number of books and some absolutely seminal articles on British politics, British electoral politics. He's responsible for recent work. It includes some very detailed work on devolution, some very detailed work on social attitudes. Tonight he's going to talk about whether first past the post still does the job in producing majoritarian government, or whether first past the post has had its day. John.
Thank you very much, John, for that very warm introduction. One of the complaints, of course, that people have about coalition governments is it involves too many people getting together in sweaty rooms. So my apologies to those of you who had to stand up, but welcome to the new politics. I'm afraid that's what we have to get used to. As I already indicated, what I want to try to do is to try and indicate to you why it is that in 2010 the first past the post electoral system failed to deliver any party an overall majority. And I want to try and suggest to you that that isn't just an accident, that actually it's the product of long-run changes in the electoral geography and the pattern of electoral support in the UK. And to that degree, at least as it were, it clearly raises questions about some of the traditional arguments that are used in favour of using that electoral system. Now, let me make perfectly clear straight away. It seems to me there is a perfectly reasonable case for the idea of majoritarian government, which lies at the heart of at least what is the principal case usually put forward to first past the post. There's also some arguments about the accountability of MPs that I might touch on towards the end. But the principal case for first past the post is essentially as follows. It's a crucial characteristic is that it provides for a system of alternating single party majority government. So sometimes Conservative rule, sometimes Labour rule, but the crucial point is that when they rule, they have an overall majority. And it's argued that the benefit of having that kind of system is that governments are then clearly held accountable. If, for the sake of argument, the Labour Party have been in power and the electorate come to the conclusion they think the Labour Party have made a mess of it, they can quite clearly ensure that the Labour Party is voted out and the Conservatives are in their place. And equally, they can do exactly the same thing if they form the same judgment about a Conservative government. So then it's perfectly clear that the verdict of the electorate determines the fate of governments. And in particular, it's the fate of the electorate that determines the fate of governments, rather than indeed deals made in sweaty back rooms. So that's a very clear case, and it's essentially a case that says, look, the principal function of an election is about enabling the electorate to choose between governments, and some of the finer detail about making sure that, you know, every party gets its fair share of MPs in the House of Commons, that's a subsidiary question, and it's not so important. Now, of course, there then must be something about first past the post and the way in which it operates that ensures that this vision of what elections should be about is actually delivered. And it's that essentially that I'm going to look at. But of course, immediately what happened in 2010 raises questions about whether or not first past the post does indeed deliver what it's supposed to. First of all, no single party did indeed secure an overall majority. We then indeed have a coalition that was formed as the result of 4 days' work of backroom deals. And as I said, what I want to look at here is, was this simply an accident? Should we ignore it? Is it just a one-off, no likely to be repeated, or is it indeed the result of longer-term changes? Now, what are the characteristics of the way in which first past the post is supposed to work that indeed helps to ensure that it delivers that majoritarian vision of what elections are about? And I'm going to identify 4 crucial characteristics that between them underlie the way in which people think first past the post is supposed to work, and works in such a way that it delivers that majoritarian vision. The first thing that it's meant to do is that it's meant to discourage people from voting for third parties. Because allegedly the system makes it difficult for third parties to win seats, voters are meant to come to the conclusion it's a pretty silly thing to do to vote for third parties, be they Liberal Democrat, be they SNP, be they BNP, be they whatever. The only sensible thing to do, because the only votes that are likely to count, is either a Conservative vote or a Labour vote. So the first thing that's meant to happen is that most votes are meant to be for the 2 big parties. And in any event, if indeed people are silly enough to vote for third parties, those votes are unlikely to be reflected in the composition of the House of Commons. The system is meant to discriminate against third parties, not to give them very much in the way of representation. And of course, if there aren't many third-party MPs in the House of Commons, other things being equal, it's obviously pretty likely that one or the other 2 big parties is going to end up with an overall majority, because once one of those parties got past the other, if there aren't many third-party MPs, then by definition you're pretty close to the 326 mark. The third element, however, that's meant to ensure that FPP delivers that majoritarian vision is that it's a system that delivers whoever comes first, whether it's Conservative or Labour, whoever comes first gets a bonus. In other words, the system doesn't just discriminate against third parties, but it particularly advantages who comes first. But, and this is a crucial element of the majoritarian vision, it doesn't matter which that first party is. So if the Conservatives come first, the electoral system gives them a bonus, and if the Labour Party comes first, it gives them a bonus. So it's colourblind so far as to who gets the bonus. It's simply that whoever comes first gets that bonus. And because a party that comes first gets that bonus of seats, that helps to ensure that whoever comes first gets past the 326 mark, and we have a single party government. So those are the 4 crucial mechanisms that underlie the ability of FPP allegedly to deliver that majoritarian vision. Now, essentially what I'm going to do is I'm going to take each of those 4 elements, and I'm going to argue that experience suggests that and it's not just in 2010, but we now have a consistent record of those elements not being in place. So you may still believe in the majoritarian vision of democracy. There is a perfectly reasonable case for the majoritarian vision of democracy, but I want to suggest that the problem now for those who believe in that vision is that first past the post now looks a rather uncertain instrument for delivering that vision. So it's an argument about, essentially it says, let's accept the criteria that those who traditionally defend post-past system use and say what is good about the system. So I'm accepting those criteria, but I'm arguing that the mechanics of the system are now such that it's uncertain that actually the first past the post system can fulfill the criteria that the advocates of that system usually espouse. Okay, exhibit number one. Exhibit number one is simply to show you the share of the vote won by Conservative and Labour combined at each election since 1922. Why do we start in 1922? Well, for two crucial reasons. Reason number one, it's the first election since the partition of Ireland, so it's only from 1922 onwards that we're talking about the same geographical area. And of course, long before the partition of Ireland, most representation in what is now the Republic of Ireland at Westminster was already divorced from the two-party system. Second reason for highlighting on 1922 is that that is the first election in which the Labour Party overtook the Liberals, and in effect, therefore, Conservative and Labour have been the two largest parties from that election onwards. And as you can see, this is all a very familiar story. During the course of the interwar period, gradually the Liberals got squeezed, such that by the early 1950s, it was indeed the case that virtually everybody was either a little Labour or a little Conservative, to paraphrase Gilbert and Sullivan. But gradually, the system has changed. Note in particular a very large drop in February 1974, which of course is the last time that we had a hung parliament. But February 1974 wasn't the end of the story, and it's kept on declining ever since. And it's now in a situation where, again, including votes in Northern Ireland, only around 65% of the votes cast across the UK as a whole are cast for either Conservative and Labour. And that share is lower at any election since and including 1922. In other words, Conservative and Labour dominance of the electorate in 2010 was lower than it ever had been since Conservative and Labour have been the two largest parties in the UK. Now, and worth perhaps particularly pointing out that this decline in support for Conservative and Labour isn't just a story of the Liberal Democrats. It's partly to do with the Liberal Democrats, but it's also, and particularly recent, also to do with parties other than Conservative, Labour and Liberal Democrat. What I'm simply showing you on this next slide is simply the proportion of the vote that goes to parties other than Conservative, Labour and Liberal Democrat. And as you can see, particularly again since the 1970s, it's been on a pretty substantial rise. And in 2010, we had nearly 12% of the vote. 1 in 8 people were voting for none of the big three parties, with UKIP and BNP in particular doing well, relatively well. So we're now seeing quite substantial fracturing of the British electorate, even beyond the three parties that we might think of as now dominating Westminster. So point one is, voters are voting for third parties, even third parties beyond the Liberal Democrats, despite the disincentives that the system supposedly gives them. Number two, third party representation. Let me first of all look at the Liberal Democrats. I mean, an awful lot has been written, an awful lot of excitement has been generated, and John's already referring to it, about the fact the Liberal Democrats only got 57 seats rather than the 62, and wasn't this a terrible disaster for them that they were 5 seats down on 2005? Well, the point I want to get across to you is that is a very, very myopic view of British politics. The old joke, of course, in the 1950s and 1960s was that it was possible to get the whole of the Parliamentary Liberal Party in a taxi and still have a seat to spare. Those days didn't just disappear in 2010 or in 2005. Notice that we've now had 4 elections in a row in which getting around 50 seats or so has begun to look like a norm for the Democrats. Whereas before that, they never managed to get past 24, even in 1983. So clearly something has changed about the electoral system and the way in which it treats the Democrats that means they're getting much more in the way of seats. And that even the terrible result of 57 is actually the second highest number of first past the post seats to be won by Britain's principal third party, since 1923, which in a sense was the last gasp of the old Liberal Party. So from a historical perspective, just notice how the Liberal Democrats are now winning seats. Why are they winning seats? Well, they're winning seats essentially because they've learned how to play the system. First past the post does discriminate against small parties, but it only discriminates against small parties so long as their vote is geographically reasonably evenly spread. So the problem of the old SDP Liberal Alliance in 1983, they could get 25-26% of the vote, but the trouble is they got 25-26% of the vote more or less everywhere, and thereby they ended up coming pretty much second pretty much everywhere. The Labour Party, who only got a couple of percentage points more, but whose vote was very strong in some places, very weak in others, ended up with over 200 seats. So the system only discriminates not against third parties in general, but third parties with geographically evenly distributed votes. Now, the statistic up here may or may not pass you by. It's the standard deviation, which is simply a measure of how much does a party's vote vary from one constituency to another. And the point about this statistic is the bigger it is, the more geographically uneven a party's vote is. Now, as compared with Conservative and Labour, the Liberal Democrat vote is still relatively geographically evenly spread. But it is not as evenly spread as it was. The Liberal Democrats have learned to duck themselves in some places. Andrew Russell has done a lot of work demonstrating how they've managed to do this by lots of clever local and constituency campaigning. But the point is, therefore, as a result, for any given share of the vote, the Liberal Democrats now are rather more able to win seats. Of course, then equally also, and again tends to be forgotten, again, it's not just the story of the Liberal Democrats. What I'm now doing on this slide is adding to the blue line, which is the seats that have been won by the Liberals, Democrats and their predecessor parties in the past. I'm also adding on top of it, first of all, seats that have been won by other parties within Great Britain, and then seats won by other parties, including Northern Ireland. And again, I mean, look at the last four elections. The last four elections, yes, it's around 50 Liberal Democrats or so, and it's around 80 or 90 third-party MPs of all descriptions or so. Quite a substantial proportion of the House of Commons. And that, of course, is a product of the fact, and again, the February 1974 election here is crucial. Two things about February 1974. Number one, it's the point at which it becomes perfectly clear that the Northern Ireland party system was separating from that of the rest of the UK, and thereafter basically all Northern Ireland MPs have ended up being not either Conservative or Labour, and of course, as has already been referred to, David Cameron's attempt to reintegrate part of the unionist community within the British two-party system in 2010 failed. Second aspect, of course, is the emergence of nationalists in Scotland and Wales. Small, yes, but geographically concentrated, relatively speaking, so they're able to pick up a degree of representation. So now we think nothing of around 18 Northern MPs that have nothing to do with Conservative or Labour, around 10, a dozen or so Scottish or Welsh nationalists, we don't blink an eye. But again, think of the historical record. Before February 1974, we would have gone, what? You mean? Surely not. So again, things are very different. And of course, with 80 or 90 third-party MPs in the House of Commons, as opposed to as little as a half a dozen or so, as was the case in the 50s or 60s, it is bound to be true, other things being equal, that hung parliaments are more likely. But things are not equal, and indeed they've not been the same as they were in the 1950s and 1960s for some time. And this is to do with the issue of the ability of first past the post to give the winner a bonus. Now, why is first past the post meant to be able to give the winner the bonus? Well, point number one is that there are meant to be lots of seats across the country where Conservative and Labour are, at any election, pretty close to each other. They're the marginal seats we keep on talking about. Sometimes they're won by the Conservatives, sometimes they're won by Labour. We need to have a lot of those marginal seats if it's going to be the case that a small swing from, let us say, Conservative to Labour results in a lot of seats switching from Conservative to Labour. And we need that to happen if first past the post is going to work. Because unless a lot of seats change hands for a relatively small movement of votes, it isn't going to be the case that whoever comes first is necessarily going to get past the 326 mark. All right? It's the fact that historically we had lots of marginal seats that meant small movement of votes, big movement of seats. So even though, as was often true in the 50s and 60s, whoever came first, lead, 2%, 3%, pretty narrow outcome, still got a safe overall majority in the House of Commons. So clearly, therefore, the degree to which the system produces a bonus is going to depend on how many marginal seats there are. If the number of marginal seats falls, the bonus is going to diminish too. And this is precisely what has happened. In fact, it happened a long time ago. In fact, it really began to kick in February 1974, which, of course, again, now was the last time we had a hung parliament, and we're beginning to see really was the beginning of a different era. Now, for those of you who are technically minded, let me explain very briefly how I define a marginal seat. One of the things, obviously, you need to do if you're going to do this consistently is you have to kind of make the point of comparison the same across all elections. So the first thing that I do is I say, well, let's apply a uniform swing at each election so that Conservative and Labour have got the same, hypothetically got the same share of the vote. But I'm assuming they get the same share of the vote, but the geographical distribution of their vote is as it was at that election. And then, having done that, a marginal seat is in effect a seat where, leaving aside the votes cast for Liberal Democrats and others, the lead of the first party over the second party is no more than 10 percentage points. Okay, so that's providing you with a consistent measure, as it were, of the middle, the seats that are going to be competitive between Conservative and Labour at an election where those two parties are pretty much 50-50 with each other, and where the winner's bonus is going to be crucial. Now, up until the 1970s, as you can see, we had around 150, 160 seats that were consistently marginal by that definition. And there's lots of lovely, wonderful, learned academic articles that demonstrate that as a result of that, as a result of about 1% of the votes changing hands, a 1% swing, about 3% of the seats would change hands. That was pretty much the number you needed. But as you can see, in the 1970s it fell away. It started to recover a bit in the 1990s, but not anything like back to the status quo ante, and it's not gone back down again. And this isn't even just something to do with the last 4 elections. This has now been true at every election for more than 30 years. So it's become pretty much, looks like a fixture. Now you may be saying to yourself, well, how did that happen? Well, it's a story that people are probably rather familiar with. We don't talk about it very much these days because it hasn't happened so much more recently, but actually it has left a very substantial legacy. And it's that old story whereby the Labour Party has, particularly from the period from the mid-1950s through to the late 1980s, became more and more concentrated in support in the north of England and Scotland. The north of England and Scotland kept on, as compared with the rest of the country, getting more and more Labour, whereas the southern half of England, together with the Midlands, kept on becoming more and more Conservative, relatively speaking. And the figures on this slide demonstrate that. So as you can see, the plus figures mean the Conservatives are doing relatively well in this part of the country. The minus figures mean the Labour Party are doing relatively well. There's no presumption there, and there's no value judgment there. That's just simply a convention. And so you can see over that 30-year period from 1955 to 1987, Scotland, relatively speaking, is almost 20% more Labour than it was. Remember, in the 1950s, the Conservatives could win 50% of the votes in Scotland. So there was this big movement. Now, why does this matter? Well, it's just the country moving apart. Now, if the country is moving apart and constituencies in one part of the country are becoming more and more Labour, constituencies in another part are becoming more and more Conservative, there was increasingly less and less left in the middle. And that's why the number of marginal seats fell. Now, under New Labour, the Labour Party had a relatively degree of success in doing relatively well in the south of England. So as you can see, from 1987 to 97, some of the movement was reversed. And that's why the number of marginal seats started to creep back up again. But once the Labour Party got in power, it didn't last. Relatively speaking, the Labour Party has been doing relatively better in the north of England and Scotland again, not dramatically so, except, of course, in 2010 in Scotland. Very big different result. So this continuous movement of the country apart has just ensured that we get fewer and fewer marginal seats, and therefore the bonus is much weaker than it once was. Another way of just looking at this is just very simply summarising how again in 2010 the country moved apart. Just simply showing the swing in all the seats the Conservatives were defending and all the seats that Labour were defending. And the swing to the Conservatives, on average, was stronger in the places where the Conservatives were already strongest, which therefore inevitably meant that the country was falling apart. Okay, so we've done 3 bits. People now vote for parties other than Conservative and Labour. Those parties succeed in getting representation. And thirdly, the system has lost its bonus. So it's more difficult for both Conservative and Labour to get past the 326 mark. That leads to the 4th element, the bias, about which a lot of is causing a lot of excitement in the House of Commons at the moment. There's a whole series of reasons why, in practice, either Conservative or Labour may be advantaged by this first-past-the-post system as opposed to the other big parties. So I'm not talking here about bias against Liberal Democrats or third parties. That's a different story. This is how the system might advantage Conservative over Labour or vice versa. And there are a whole variety of reasons as to why this might happen. One is that constituencies are uneven in size, and one lot's constituencies tend to be bigger than the other. Another, however, is that simply fewer people turn out to vote in the constituencies of one party rather than another. And then there's what can also make a difference, actually, if the vote for third parties is bigger in one party's constituencies than another, that can also make a difference, but that's very technical. So constituencies can be uneven in size, either because they've got more people registered in them or because more people turn up to vote. Second thing, however, is a party may end up having its vote more efficiently distributed. Which basically, what you want to do under first past the post is you basically want to win as many constituencies as possible by 1 seat. If you're going to win, you just need to win narrowly, by 1 vote. If you win constituencies by more than 1 vote, those additional votes are wasted. They don't add to your tally. And if you're going to lose, you might as well lose in spades. Losing narrowly is a complete waste of time under first past the post, okay? So if a party wins more constituencies by small majorities, it's going to do better out of the system. Now, I don't propose to go into the details of this, but this is one of the measures that you can use to get an indication of the degree to which there is a bias from all of those sources, from one party rather than another. And the crucial thing to realise is that if we are below the 0 point, then basically the Conservatives are being disadvantaged, and if we're above, the Conservatives are advantaged. And the crucial point to take away is that indeed until around the 1990s or so, well, yes, the Conservatives got advantaged a bit here, or Labour got advantaged a bit here, but there wasn't a dramatic bias in the system. But in the 1990s, a clear dramatic bias against the Conservatives emerged from the system. It declined somewhat in 2010, but it's still noticeable. Why has this happened? Why is this bias still there? Well, one of it is what has produced part of the constituencies and referendum bill, which is that the sizes of electorates are uneven. It's absolutely correct. The average Conservative constituency in 2010 contained about 4,000 more voters than the average Labour constituency. But that's not the only story. There's also a big difference in turnout between them. Conservative constituencies, 68% turnout, Labour 61%. And there's also a little bit, though it's nothing like so dramatic this election, a little bit still the Labour Party being able to win more seats by small majorities. So all in all, the various sources of bias are tending to advantage the Labour Party still as compared with the Conservatives. Now, putting all of this together, right, taking the system, bias to Labour, not enough marginal seats, third-party representation, what does this mean you end up with? Now, this is, as it were, my poor version of Peter Snow's swingometer. But it's designed to show you how the system now operates. The line that's emboldened is the 2010 election result. I'm then showing you what would happen as a result of various uniform swings that produce the leads indicated on the left-hand side. All right? So the 11.2 bottom line is basically just under a 2% swing from Labour to Conservative in every constituency since 2010. And there are 2 things to take away with this. One is, yes, there is a bias. It's still the case under the current boundaries that the Conservatives needed around an 11-point lead for majority, whereas Labour only needed around a 3-point lead. But the second thing, and perhaps the more important thing, is the size of that range. There is now, on these figures, and this assumes that third-party support is unchanged and all the rest of it, but on these figures, we now have a 14-point range of outcomes that produces a hung parliament. And that, if you do all these calculations for all previous elections, that range has never, ever been bigger than it is now. Okay, very, very quickly, how will any of this be changed by the Constituencies Bill? Well, the headline is, it will make some difference, but not as much as people imagine. One of the things I'm surprised there hasn't been more commentary about is, even under the provisions of the bill, the constituency boundaries in 2015 will still be nearly 5 years out of date, because they're going through on the basis of elections in December 2010. But equally, also crucially, it won't affect the other sources of bias. It will not. The constituency bills will not persuade more people to turn out to vote in Labour constituencies. It's also very unlikely, and I'm happy to go into this in detail later on, to actually have much impact on the range of results that produces a hung parliament. In other words, the likely effect of the constituency bill is, yes, the Conservatives will probably not need an 11-point lead, it will come down a bit, but equally the lead that Labour will need will go up a bit, and i.e. the effect will be to ensure that indeed the range of results that produce a hung parliament encompasses even more clearly pretty much any relatively narrow outcome. So, to conclude, FPP no longer works in the way that people expect, because it no longer stops people supporting third parties. It's no longer as effective as it once was at denying third parties representation. It's become less effective at giving the winning party a bonus. And it's no longer even-handed in its treatment of the two largest parties, albeit that may be reduced somewhat by the Constituencies Bill. As a result, I would suggest to you that first past the post is no longer a reliable mechanism for delivering that vision of alternating single-party government, that majoritarian vision. And the other implication is, it may be that the AV referendum is going to be proved the most irrelevant referendum anybody could ever devise, because it may well be that even if we don't change the system, sweaty rooms like this and hung parliaments are here to stay.
Thank you very much indeed, John, for that stimulating talk. Now, we're going to go into a panel discussion and a wider question and answer session very shortly indeed, but we've got time for 2 or 3 very quick questions directly to John on the topics that he's covered there. Just 2 rules: questions, not statements. And secondly, the questions wait for the microphone to come to them, because this is being televised by the BBC Parliament channel. Okay. Gentleman at the front there, lady behind, and then the gentleman there, and that will be the 3 questions. Okay.
Should we take the 3 questions? Well,
take 3 questions in one tranche, yeah.
John Strafford. Professor Curtis, could I put it to you, named your talk how FPP is supposed to work, and that it provides for a system of alternating single-party majority government. Could I put to you that that is a myth today, and has always been a myth, because single-party majority government with a working majority has only been replaced by another with a working majority once in the last 100 years, and that was in 1970.
Thank you. And the lady behind.
Monica Threlfall, London Metropolitan University. I just want to take you up quickly on your reference to backroom deals, because this comes up in all the textbooks, and whenever there's reference to PR, it's always said, ooh, this leads to backroom deals and so on. I think it's not useful, because in fact, you could say, from another perspective, that what the Conservatives and Liberals did was to put together a government in the face of the fact that their number of seats more closely reflected the votes of the citizens of the country than before. Because, as you well know, the huge advantage of having a first party, a leading party with enough seats to govern alone, is merely because there's a distortion of the popular will. And that shouldn't always be presented as a perfect part of the system.
Thank you. And the gentleman in the striped tie. 4 rows back.
Hi, my name's Tim Smith. I wanted to ask you regarding, you talked about at the next election, some of the malapportionment would be taken away by the fact that with the constituencies bills. But isn't it possible that given that Labour's lost a lot of seats, so there's a lot of incumbents have gone out, we've also got a lot of Conservatives who will, after, say, a few years, will have a first-term incumbency effect, so you might indeed have a double incumbency effect at the next election. That might actually mean that the bias swings away. You had it at -2, I think, on your chart. It could actually swing the other way, or at least towards, at least back towards par, because of this incumbency effect.
Okay, let me stand up for a second. John Strachan said, well, hang on, weren't you being too kind to the first past the posters? Maybe I have elsewhere written saying, well, actually, if you indeed apply the criterion of how many elections over the 20th century produce a safe overall majority, you can question as to the degree whether or not first past the post does it. But what I was wanting to do was to make it clear that the degree to which things have changed. In other words, you may argue you may feel it was always a dubious case, but the point is, I was trying to argue that the case has become yet more dubious. So I hope you allow me that indulgence. As far as backroom deals are concerned, well, I just simply say to you, remember what I was trying to do was to present the case of those who dislike proportional representation, who prefer a majoritarian vision, okay? And there undoubtedly is an argument to be had about whether or not you think elections are about producing a representative legislature, or whether they're about choosing between alternative government. And there are clear different democratic theories and different emphases about election. And I would certainly take the view that at the end of the day, your choice between those two things is, in the sense, is to do with values. It's not, nobody can prove that one is better than the other. But the point that I was trying to do was say, well, if you believe in majoritarian democracy, the trouble is that first past the post isn't very good at delivering it. So I was taking it from that perspective. Tim, must admit I didn't entirely quite get the point. If it's, I take your point that first-time incumbents are likely to generate a bonus. You can see that in 2010. But given that there was a substantial turnover on both the Labour and the Conservative side, and particularly was a substantial turnover on the Labour side, then presumably there are going to be a lot of Labour, rather unusually for a party that is currently in opposition, there's going to be rather a lot of Labour seats that are going to be defended by new incumbents who are going to get that first-time bonus. And then therefore, isn't that going to make it more difficult for the Conservatives to win these seats? So, if anything, I think the argument goes in the other direction, but maybe I misunderstood your point.
Okay, there will be further opportunities to question John Curtis later, but now I want to hand over to Ruth Fox, Director of the Parliament and Government Programme at the Hansard Society, because Ruth is going to host the panel discussion, which will be followed by Q&A.
Okay, thank you, John. As Andrew spoke about earlier, we've got 3 panellists with us tonight who wrote chapters on the party perspectives in this campaign. And for the next few minutes, I'm going to ask them to explore some of the key issues arising from their chapters and their perspectives on what happened for the parties, and then we'll throw it open to an open discussion on the floor and continue the Q&A. I want to turn first to Stephen. You have an interesting table in your book, polling data shortly after the election by Stan Greenberg, the US pollster, which shows that on a range of indicators, there wasn't actually that much difference between the parties in terms of public perceptions. The one where there is significant difference is immigration, the right approach to immigration, and where the public thought the right kind of change was going to emerge. And Labour was behind on those 2 measures. But on things like the economy, public perceptions quite relatively in tune with the Labour Party manifesto. Can you tell us a bit more about that and what you think that means for the future in terms of sort of Labour rebuilding its coalition of support as it goes forward in light of the new political landscape we face?
Yes, Stan Greenberg did the weekend after the election, and that is therefore during the time of the coalition, what would be the coalition. It was all very dynamic, apparently. He asked representative range of voters, he gave them what he called policy pairs. He said, what do you think about this? at all that. And the most striking one, anyway, that came from this is it was the proposition, this is a time for government to get more involved. Do you support that proposition? Or this is a time to depend more on markets? So they had to choose one or the other. Now, if you just think about that, you know, this is a time for government to get more involved, or this is a time for more markets. And just think what you might think was going to be the broad sort of support for either of those. 71% of people preferred the first, i.e. this is a time for more government, 22 more markets. Which I mean, clearly, general elections aren't simply dichotomous choices, there's other things, and general elections are also decided on more than simply policies. But I think what that shows is that at that particular point in time, Labour, the sort of proposition that we associate with the Labour Party, had more support than the actual result for the party, the vote that the party got, would suggest. So there's a kind of disparity between some of the policies that people could have supported in the election and the parties that were embodying those policies. And there was another survey done by Murray during the course of the election, or just prior to it, which suggested that how a party's image was becoming, how it presented itself was becoming much more important than its actual policies, which is something most people think was happening anyway, but it's part of a progressive thing. And the problem for the Labour Party was, of course, that it was embodied, it was personified by Gordon Brown. And I wrote, prior to this, not wishing to blame Gordon Brown for anything, because everybody else was. And I was determined not to do that. But unfortunately, the more I... at two levels, unfortunately, at two levels, that he personified, the way he put himself across, we were all familiar with the imagery and all those superficial things, but that was taken to be very important by some people. But also the strategic lack of coherence, really, I think that's possibly as important. Strategic lack of coherence that Brown's number 10 kind of embodied, that it wasn't quite clear where Labour was going, I think. So that looking forward, after the election, who's going to be, when either of the Miliband's becomes Labour leader, I think from that position, Labour, there is quite a lot of support, or potential support, for positions that Labour was associated with. And to be fair to Ed Miliband, through the manifesto, he tried to get that support. He tried to articulate, tried to give Labour a narrative, but the person responsible for putting the narrative across was unfortunately not able to do that. And a campaign is not usually the time to do it. So I think there's a lot of support. Now, the problem for Labour is that now, if those two questions were asked again, because David Cameron has been very successful in framing the question in a certain way, I'd be very surprised if you had a 71-22 split. Now, it may even be the other way around, because once you're in government, you can start controlling, if you have the strategic vision and the ability to kind of mould how people think. So it's good news for Labour in a sense, but also bad news, I think. There's a lot of work to do, but there's a lot of potential out there, I think, still.
Okay, I've no doubt some of the questions will revisit some of those themes. Andrew, before the election, in the run-up to it, there was a lot of questions about Nick Clegg's leadership, and at one point he was only polling sort of 13% as a candidate who was adjudged to be suitable to be Prime Minister. You then have the first party leaders debate, and very shortly afterwards he's in the stratosphere in terms of his poll ratings, and apparently we were all agreeing with Nick. But Cleggmania, the bubble burst. You talk a lot about that in your chapter. Can you give us your reflections on why that was?
Yeah, okay. I mean, we don't mention it in the chapter, but I'm struck by a joke that was used on the Vote Now show on Monday the 12th of April. They said that the party leaders had three aims in the first televised debate. Brown was hoping to appear more human, Cameron was hoping he'd appear less posh, Brown is hoping he'd appear more human, and Clegg is hoping he'd be recognised and allowed into the studio. And I think there is I think the Lib Dem leader was always in a privileged position with that first debate because the threshold was so low. We know that Lib Dem leaders in previous elections have always gone up. Their ratings have always gone up during the campaign, and what we saw was the apotheosis of that, I think, during the first TV debate when Clegg just became this figure that was able to reach out and connect with many voters. And that Cleggmania kind of boost apparently persevered right up until the moment of the exit poll. And I'm still waiting for Ian Dale and Danny Alexander to run naked through the streets of Whitehall as they promised to do if the exit poll was right. That's the Chief Executive of the Treasury doing that, but never mind. But if you look at, I think the secret for why that didn't happen is about geography, and it's about the geography of the Lib Dem vote. John Curtis has just rightly talked about the kind of myth that first past the post holds back significantly the Liberal Democrats. And in fact, if you look at their big increase from the 1992 to 1997 elections, they more than double their seats, despite the fact that the national share of the vote falls. And the secret is about targeting. It allows the party to be different in different parts of the country according to the opposition. The downside of that was that they just didn't have the infrastructure. They weren't credible in enough seats to kind of match that national standing of the leader and of the party. That people might have liked them, but just felt that there wasn't enough of evidence on the ground for them to vote for. I think that's a crucial element of it. Secondly, I think that Labour's core vote strategy, the idea to get out their core vote at the end of the campaign, may have had an effect on possibly diluting Lib Dem victories, and also the well publicised tactic of the Lib Dems to say that the moral authority to try and form a government would go to a party that had the most votes and the most seats. I think that was fairly obviously code for the Conservatives, and again that might have persuaded certain tactical voters not to switch over to the Lib Dems. I also think that there are other factors. It's interesting that this election is characterised by Rochdale. That Rochdale moment, that kind of bigot gate, however you want to call it, right, could have happened to anybody. Right? Any party leader could have been hung out to dry like that. But if we'd have taken bets, we'd have all known which one was the most likely that it would have happened to. Right? I said at an event the other week, I mean, it's a kind of, that moment is the kind of Sheffield rally of the 2010 general election. It's somehow emblematic of the kind of transfer of power or the failure of Labour to deliver. But like the Sheffield rally, absolutely insignificant in terms of votes. Right? Now Rochdale was a redistricted seat. The Lib Dems had the incumbent MP, although actually, if you look at the way that the seat was redistricted, it was a Labour seat. So for the Lib Dems to fail to take Rochdale was a significant indication that things were going wrong. Quickly, I'd also make the point, incumbency, really important for the Lib Dems. Of the 7 MPs of the 7 seats where Lib Dem MPs retired, they lost 5 of those seats. It's a bit of a cause and effect there, of course, but I think they would be confident that some of those incumbents could have held on to them. I also think that it affects the default position of the party. Most Lib Dem MPs think that they have their place in Parliament due to their opposition to the closure of a post office or their campaigning for a new hospital wing. They don't think they owe it to the leader. Had the Cleggmania bubble translated into a big increase in Lib Dem votes and Lib Dem MPs, that would have transformed the nature of the party completely once they were in Parliament. Because suddenly you'd have had this great flux of people who owed their position to Nick Clegg, and that wasn't quite delivered. However, I would say one final point in that I think that Cleggmania kind of atmosphere did deliver one crucial thing. In the post-election environment, it made Clegg a more credible statesman, if you like, a more obvious potential coalition partner, a more potential statesman, and indeed it leads to him becoming Deputy Prime Minister, which I think few of us could have predicted. Steve's right, Andrew and John are right to look at the people that thought he'd won the election debate, the leadership debate, but was still trailing behind in who would make the best Prime Minister. It's good people basically knew he wasn't going to be Prime Minister, but But the credibility gains from that does have an effect on the outcome of the election, if not the outcome of the vote.
Okay, thank you. Turning now to the Conservatives and Jane. The Conservatives did better than the other parties but didn't win, so the detoxification of the Conservative brand worked in the sense that it ironed out the negatives, but didn't necessarily bring about the kind of positives that Cameron and his team would have been hoping for. And there wasn't the revival of the Conservative Party that perhaps they were anticipating. Now, if you ask some of the Conservatives, part of the reason, the rationale is election bias, some of the kinds of issues that are obviously coming up in terms of the legislation at the moment, the reduction of number of seats and so on. Equalisation of seats, I should say. Your take on this, you addressed this throughout your chapter, so can you give us your thoughts on why the Conservatives didn't win as an outright victory?
Thank you, Ruth. Absolutely. So Andrew, in his remarks when he was introducing each of us, said that I argue that the sort of attitudes towards the Conservative Party went from cold to warm, and they went from cold to warm, but they really went from cold to lukewarm. Across a range of criteria. And so what I try to do in the chapter is to try to kind of get ahead of the myth which I think may arise and which the Labour Party may be concentrating on at the moment, which is that all you need to do is get a relatively popular leader, be quite moderate, move to the centre and talk about a broad set of issues, and rather than just sticking to the issues on which you're most popular, and that's your way into number 10. Essentially, if we think about those 5 years, it's again worth thinking about some context here. The first couple of years in which David Cameron was leader, his popularity ratings were pretty much going in the same direction as the ratings went for Ian Duncan Smith, William Hague and Michael Howard before him. What changes all of that? Well, there's a theme that goes throughout my chapter, which is essentially the economy. 2008, in the autumn of 2008, we all remember extremely well for obvious things that happened in the economy, but what then occurred for Conservative Party ratings were just more positive ratings for David Cameron, for the Conservative Party's likely handling on a big set of issues on the economy and in its vote intentions. So then you have a Conservative Party that's looking like it's prospering much better and may even hit that kind of 40% vote mark, which will deliver it a comfortable majority in office. So what then occurs? Well, I suppose what my chapter tries to do is try to say, well, what did David Cameron not achieve, which he set out to achieve when his famous leader speech in the Conservative Party conference. And one of the really important things which that may have gone unnoticed, I mean, the bottom line story is that the vote intention gain of just under 4% wasn't very large. It wasn't certainly large in relative terms, but neither was the increase in ratings across a broad set of criteria. So if you think about what's really important to the vote, you think about, we think about how well is the party likely to do on the economy, how popular is its leader, who says they're a Conservative, who's willing to identify with the party, is the party best rated on a broad set of issues apart from immigration, which is an interesting one because that was a positive issue but they didn't talk about it, which party is closest to voters in terms of its left-right position or whatever position you want to call it these days. And on all of those different ways of thinking about how a party might start to gain support, the Conservative Party essentially comes out not that different to Labour as it hits the general election. So very importantly, we've often thought about, we have a measure that electoral studies use to try to get at, how do people really feel about political parties? Or are they willing to identify with the political parties? We call it party identification. You hear about it talked of partisanship in America. David Cameron, or rather the Conservative Party under David Cameron, didn't manage to increase that very important level of people in the electorate who said, yes, I'm a Conservative. So you have a period, the 1992 to 97 period is very famous for all of that jettisoning of, or that loss of Conservative support over that time. Essentially, it hasn't improved since then. So in the last election volume, also edited by Andrew and John, myself and Phil Cowley were talking about the flatlining in the vote share of Conservative support. Well, that's changed. Vote intention started to increase for the Conservatives, but that flatlining of real sort of stable support, people who say that they're willing to identify with the Conservatives, has still remained. So we don't see an increase in people who are willing to say they're a Conservative. Now, you could say that's just context, that's expensive, that's just unpopularity of parties, two parties on the whole. except that the same share for Labour is still quite high, and the Labour Party hasn't lost those people that are willing to still say that they're fundamentally Labour, even though they didn't vote for the party in 2010. So they lost their vote intention, have still that kind of latent expressive support in the electorate. David Cameron won in terms of increasing his vote share, but hasn't increased that basic support. So there's a lot of different evaluations that we can look at, but essentially, really importantly, 2010, January, Britain comes out of recession officially, and the Labour Party's ratings on the economy and the Conservative Party's ratings on the economy start to converge again. So that lead that the Conservative Party would have wanted, that thing that has propelled David Cameron's Conservative Party into much more popularity from 2008 onwards than the Labour Party, that advantage starts to diminish. And depending on which data you look at, it's pretty much neck and neck as you go into the election. So what do voters think when parties are pretty much the same? If you think about even David Cameron's leadership support, his kind of net satisfaction, dissatisfaction rating, which Maury helpfully asked lots and lots of questions over a long time period, even that advantage started to decline as the Conservatives neared the general election. Even Gordon Brown's rating on that same issue or that same criteria even managed to increase. So you have a somewhat of a narrowing. You have a narrowing in terms of which party is trusted on the economy. You have a narrowing in terms of which party is best on a range of issues. And voters, even though many people in this room see large differences between the parties, voters aren't seeing those differences. And so what you get when you ask people, do you see a big difference between the parties? 1987, you see about 80 or so % of people say yes. And now it's about 20% of people say yes, there's a big difference between the parties. So people don't know who to vote for. That's why we had a lot of confusion. That's why you might have seen people go to minor parties. And that's why fundamentally the Conservative Party needed to give a positive message for why you should vote Conservative. And I think essentially they were perhaps a little complacent, thinking that essentially just voting against Labour would be sufficient. And I think the bottom line was the campaign didn't then move voters sufficiently to overcome that pretty much neck and neck rating that most voters ascribed to the two major parties.
Okay, thank you. Right, well, we'll throw it open to you now on the floor for your questions. We have got a couple of, as you know, the roving microphones. So what I'm going to ask is to try and get a question from this side and a question from that side, just so we can manage the mics. Can I ask you, as before, to just hang on a few seconds before you speak, just to make sure you've got the microphone in front of you for the purposes of the audio and video recording of this event. Can I urge you to keep your questions as short as possible, as succinct as possible, to ask questions, not make long-winded comments, so we can get through as many questions as we can tonight, so it's a big audience. So, any questions? Right, okay. Gentleman here on the edge, midway down here on my right-hand side as I look at it. And any questions from this side? And the gentleman at the end. Yeah.
John Kay. Isn't the simplest explanation the best one always? And the simplest explanation is the British electorate thinks after 13 years that's enough of this lot.
Okay, thank you. And the gentleman down here.
Thank you. Giles Marshall, mainly directed to Jane Green, just wondering whether or not, in fact, the Conservative Party is still drawing the poison of the very polarising Thatcher years, and maybe, for David Cameron, the only way out is, in fact, a coalition that might somehow ameliorate that.
Okay, thank you. Jane, do you want to take that one first? Is it specifically directed at you?
Absolutely. So the question is, is the Conservative Party still drawing out the poison? It was really interesting that obviously Labour had their Clause 4 moment where they could really demonstrate that they'd changed. And there was so much talk within the Conservative Party of what was their Clause 4 moment to be. And essentially it was to be David Cameron. And he was to symbolically signify or embody this kind of more moderate version of conservatism. And interestingly, I think what happened was, David Cameron seemed to try to pick a fight perhaps with his party. And over a certain number of issues, and I talk about this a little bit in the book about grammar schools and so on and other issues, So what does that do? Does that tell you that David Cameron has changed the Conservative Party, or that sort of reticence to change, or that opposition that comes to those symbolic gestures, then actually tell everybody all over again, well, but fundamentally the Conservative Party hasn't changed? And I cite some evidence, I think it was a Populist or maybe a YouGov poll, which said, really showed that most voters still didn't believe the Conservative Party had truly changed. So whether they're still drawing the poison from the Thatcher years, you have to obviously remember that we do have a different cohort coming into the electorate after the 80s. And if you analyse where people think, how do people think the Conservative Party has become more centrist over time? So you look at where people place the Conservative Party, you do see that people think the Conservative Party is moving away from the right. And you even see that amongst those cohorts who were politicised under Thatcher. So they still see the Conservative Party moving. So it's a complex story. I think possibly, it's part of the explanation. But I think there's a much bigger explanation that's sort of out there for us to probe over the years to come, which isn't just that. Essentially, going back to John's comments over here, is it just we just wanted to get rid of Labour, the electorate? Well, yes, but not enough to secure the Conservative Party a larger working majority. So there's interesting questions to explore.
Okay, just on John Kay's question, simplest explanation, desire for change, kick out Labour. Steve, do you just want to say anything from your perspective as the person who looked at the Labour Party?
Yes, very definitely. All the opinion polls suggested, up to 75% or so of electors wanted change, or a change of leadership team. The question is, what kind of change did people really want? And that was the problem for Labour strategists. How could they try to connect with this desire for change? How could they suggest that what they represented would be change, and yet it would still be the government? And when Gordon Brown became Labour leader, that was on the agenda still, very early on. People were really glad to get rid of Tony Blair. It's maybe hard to remember that, I don't know. But Gordon Brown wanted to represent change, so it was absolutely necessary. But what kind of change? And he never quite got what that change would be. And I'm not saying that about him, it's not criticising him personally. It's just a dilemma for Labour. How could they represent change that people said they wanted, and yet be the party of change while being in government? And people have been talking about statistics and surveys. I've got one anecdote to suggest how hard it would be, how hard it was for Labour to do that. I was in a Sky Television green room, and I was going to talk to Adam Bolton, so you can imagine I was very nervous. And I was going to talk about working class women and the election, and why many of them didn't want to vote, and they weren't quite sure. And in the green room, I was the only man in the green room, and there was only one working class woman. She was going to be the working class woman representing this group. And what I'm saying is everybody else in the room was a middle class woman. And so we were having conversations, and it was like just before going on, and some of them asked, well, what are you going to, how are you going to vote? And this was a working class woman from Salford, Hazel Blair's constituency, and she said, well, if I vote, and of course that was the whole thing, if I vote, I'm going to vote Conservative. I don't know what they stand for, but it's time for a change. And I don't know how representative she really was. But the point is that there is some truth to the wanting some kind of change, but it not being quite, people not being quite certain what it is. And I referred to the Greenberg findings. It wasn't necessarily, cutting back, reducing the state, more markets, big society. It wasn't necessarily ideological in a very firm way, but there was something there, and the problem for Labour was it could not connect with that desire, whatever the origins of that desire were.
Okay, more questions. Lady at the back there, and the gentleman, right at the back, sitting down. Have we got two microphones or just one? Just one. Okay, it's going to be a little bit slower than. Yeah.
Yvonne Galligan, Queen's University Belfast. My question is, why were prominent, articulate women politicians invisible during this election campaign, especially in media terms? Has it got to do with the nature of political campaigning now, which is now very much a presidential and certainly personalist style of politics?
Okay, can I just just take this question first. We actually have another contributor to the book who actually did the chapter on women and gender issues in the election, Professor Sarah Childs from Bristol, who's also a Hansard Society Fellow, a great supporter of the Society. She's actually sat at the back. I'm going to direct the microphone to her next to Virginia to answer that very question, because I think she's better placed than anybody on the panel to do so.
Quite looking forward to hearing what some of you guys on the panel actually had to say.
We know better than to incriminate ourselves.
Yeah, especially when it's being recorded. I think my first response is, obviously, when you focus on party leaders, if the party leaders are all male, then what you do get is the absence of other politicians, including women. But I think what was worrying, particularly this time around, was the focus on the wives. That these weren't even women politicians that were replacing women politicians, but actually women who just happened to have one day married men who ultimately became their party leaders. So I think there is a big concern. I think in part that's to do with sort of tabloids and celebrity culture. So in a sense, partly the media's fault. But I think it's also about party choices. They could have done more with the women they have. They do have women. They may not have many of them or not enough, but they could have done a lot more. I think in part that's driven, as I said, by the sort of personalisation of British politics, but also I think party choices. I don't think all the parties necessarily get the fact they should be putting their women out there. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. I expected the answer to that question. Right, the gentleman at the back there, right along... sitting on the table, so at the back.
Hiya, Elliot is my name. So, just a point on, I think, party political element to this. So, given everyone's surprised at how smoothly the coalition was formed, does a modern, relatively intelligent electorate in a time of peace need a strong government, or more specifically, a party-run government, to actually function appropriately?
I'll take one more. Gentleman at the back, just behind the camera there. Yeah.
Lewis Baston. One of the things about the election and the result in the marginals was kind of puzzling, in that the Conservatives had done everything right to try and win the marginals. Candidates in place, knocking on doors every weekend for years and years, tons of money, phone calls, resources. Why didn't it actually seem to work in terms of paying off for a higher swing in the marginal seats? It seems they had an intelligent strategy which, unless an incumbent Labour MP stood down, totally failed, and in the seats they actually needed to make the difference between 300 and 350, the swing was below average. What went wrong with that?
Okay. On the coalition, does the electorate in a time of peace need strong government? Andrew, do you want to just comment on that? Because obviously from the Liberal Democrat perspective, they have a particular interest in that.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that we're in danger of kind of overlooking is that there's quite a lot of coalition government in Britain. If you look at local government, you know, the voters of Birmingham wouldn't have been that surprised to see a Liberal Democrat Conservative coalition at the national level, because they'd had one locally for some time. If you look at the National Assembly of Wales, there's a history of coalition both between the Labour and Liberal Democrats and indeed between Labour and Plaid Cymru. If you look at the Scottish Parliament, you see a system that's almost designed to deliver Labour-Liberal Democrat coalition, although after 2007 we have a minority SNP government. And so I think the idea that coalitions are anathema is something which intrinsically voters don't always agree with. I do think, however, that it will create kind of knock-on problems for the parties when they come to campaign, and I think it will be very interesting at the next general election if, for instance, we have a Conservative Liberal Democrat coalition in Westminster and a Labour Liberal Democrat coalition in Scotland. I think it'd be really interesting to see how the parties try to campaign there. I think all the talk of a coupon election is something that the Lib Dems will never go for, because I think there are enough historians in the Liberal Democrats to know what happened previously. And I think that the evidence post the election seems to be that the coalition is quite popular. Right, and there does seem to be some evidence that you can get strong government through a coalition. The interesting aspect of that is that all the credit of that seems to be going disproportionately to one party, and that might have an effect on the long-standing longevity of the coalition. I don't know if that really answers Elliot's question, which sounded horrendously like an AIL text to me. But I do think that the kind of strong government angle, I think there is a question here about systems designed to deliver certain types of government, and just this kind of everyday acceptance that it just isn't quite that way.
Steve, do you just want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I just would question the assumption, or the implicit assumption, that a single-party government will be inherently a strong government. And the last time there was a single, party Conservative government under John Major, I wonder how far that could be considered a strong government. So there's no necessary, connection between coalition and not being strong and single-party and being strong, I would say.
Just very briefly, the problem in terms of coalition governments is not the electorate. The problem is the tribalism of party members and elected representatives. And as we hit the party conference season, that's the first problem that you're going to get for the coalition government. We're about to see the first emergence of tribalism since the coalition was formed.
Okay. Lewis's question is, why didn't the campaign matter? Jane, any thoughts generally beyond the Conservatives?
Oh, why the campaign didn't matter? If I had addressed Lewis's question in an uninformed way on this point, because we don't know, is the bottom line. I mean, I can offer two, or maybe one, hypothesis for why it matters. It's just that, we have to remember that money was very high profile, and it was very unpopular if you're contesting a seat and you're the Liberal Democrat candidate, or if you're the Labour candidate. So obviously, there's a bit of a zero-sum game going on there, potentially, but I haven't looked at the data myself. I mean, the question of why the Conservatives didn't do better in those seats they particularly needed to win, again, is a great question. And unfortunately, it's probably not the best answer, but a lot of the really good data that comes out of these elections we'll only just start to get our hands on now, really. So we hope we will provide better answers with time. And certainly John and Andrew in particular, I'm sure, will be working hard to do so.
Can I have a slight go at Lewis's question? Because Jane's right, we don't really know the answer. Point one to make is, whether or not the Tories did better in the marginals depends a bit on how you look at it. The Tories themselves will claim they did, and certainly if you compare the swing in marginals with the overall national result, the Tories did do rather better, and indeed the Tories won rather more seats than you would have expected if they'd simply been a uniform national swing. So to that degree, at least as it were, the Tories did do better in the marginals. The thing, however, that is the problem for them being able to demonstrate that the Ashcroft money made a difference is that basically the Tories did relatively well in any seat that the Labour Party was defending, irrespective of how safe or marginal it was. And to that degree, at least, as it were, the swing in the crucial set of seats that Lewis was referring to is no bigger or no less than it is the seats where, as it were, you can put up a monkey and for the Labour Party and they'll get elected, or the seats which the Labour Party didn't have a hope in, we all knew they were going to lose before the election campaign even started. So it does depend on how you look at it. Why didn't it work? Well, there is of course always one obvious reason why it didn't work, and that is that the Conservative Party was not the only player in the game. The Labour Party was also around, and certainly there's beginning to be some evidence, first of all, that actually Ron Johnston, I think, is here, presented a nice paper at the weekend which demonstrates the Labour Party spotted, as well as Ashcroft did, the seats that the Conservatives were going to win. And secondly, also, there's some other work that's been done looking at the effectiveness of local party campaigns that suggests that actually the Labour Party campaign locally was rather effective. So the answer may be that, because Labour MPs were so scared out of their wits by the Ashcroft money, they spent more time in their constituencies, they got some people out to campaign for them, and they managed to neuter it.
Okay, just on that, sort of looking at the link between marginals and the party direction of funding and the Ashcroft money debate and so on, there is actually a chapter in the book by Professor Justin Fisher on party finance and its impact, so get the book and you can read more. Right, two more questions. Gentleman right in the middle there with the dark jacket on, and then gentleman here. Yeah, that's
Mikhail Levine. If and most likely when the coalition breaks down, where do you see the future of British politics heading in light of a failed attempt to govern?
Okay, thank you. Just remind the panel, short answers, please. And the gentleman here, on the front row here. Yeah, gentleman there.
Ross Taylor. At the moment, in general, it appears that the general public are disillusioned with the main three parties, for example, with the Lib Dems selling out and working with the Conservatives. I asked the panel, do you believe that any of the others will step up to the plate and possibly become another major runner in upcoming elections? And if so, who do you think it will be?
Okay. Taking those in reverse order. John, do you want to...
Well, that's two nice, easy questions, isn't it? Yeah, fantastic. Right. I mean, let's take, I think, the real point behind Mikkel's question. I mean, there is no doubt that, British politics, in a sense, is potentially at a crossroads, all right? And I can lay out for you one scenario that says, you know what, despite what a lot of people think at the moment, the AV referendum goes through, the coalition survives for 5 years, and because of the fact that AV will just make hung parliaments rather more likely, single-party alternating government is dead. British politics has completely changed. We have to completely change the way in which we think of things. Now, there's no guarantee of that, but that at least is one of the possible outcomes of where we are currently at. If the coalition breaks down, I mean, here I just simply want to point out the potential importance of the Fixed Parliaments Bill, which utterly changes the nature of the game. Once that Fixed Parliaments Bill is in place, remember that David Cameron will no longer have the power of dissolution. And that, at least in theory, let us say, for example, the Lib Dems become really unhappy, very unhappy. And they do indeed decide to leave the coalition before the 5 years are up. So what happens then? David Cameron has a choice. He can resign, or he can try to maintain a minority government, so long as he doesn't lose a vote of confidence. So he says, I resign. Election? Not necessarily. Depends on relations between Labour and Liberal Democrats, but given the parliamentary arithmetic, if possible, the Labour and Liberal Democrats could go off talking to each other, and we simply got a change of government. Right, once we've got a fixed-term Parliaments Bill, the willingness of and so in other words, therefore, the problem that Cameron would face in that situation is, unless he's absolutely sure that the Labour Party is still in the position that it was after May the 6th, whereas it just isn't willing to do a deal with the Democrats, in resigning, he would take the risk that he simply puts himself out of power, rather than... Right. So again, in other words, the result may be, if the coalition breaks down, we get another coalition, right? You can't assume that we go to election and we get single-party government. I mean, otherwise, beyond that, let me just simply because I'm surprised nobody's asked me the question. If the coalition breaks down and we end an election, the coalition breaks down because Lib Democrats are going down the tubes in the polls, somebody I suspect will say, well, therefore somebody will get a majority. Well, I just advise you to look at Anthony Wells' UK polling report website, which is showing in graphic detail the decline in the Liberal Democrat vote. And what is it saying? What would happen in the election at the moment? Hung Parliament, right? Because all the other elements of the system, even the Liberal Democrats going down, but if we're still getting quite a lot of third-party MPs because they're still doing relatively well, and we still ain't got enough marginal seats, if we get a narrow lead for somebody or other, we still end up with a hung Parliament. So if the coalition breaks down, we might still get another coalition, because even if we have an election, we're still going to get an open job. So even if the initial scenario painted doesn't go through, we might still end up with another coalition.
Can I just add briefly to that? I agree with all that. Even if the coalition breaks down, it doesn't necessarily mean a general election. It might mean ad hoc, bill-by-bill support from the Liberal Democrats. It would be suicidal for the Liberal Democrats or Labour to engage in another general election. They haven't any money to fight it. Look at the chapter by Justin Fisher, and you'll see the very precarious state of Labour Party funding in particular. They got only a handful of cash donations from the trade unions, and virtually no non-cash donations of the type that they'd normally get to help with staff accommodation, etc. There was only one non-cash donation throughout the entire campaign. It came from a certain Anthony Charles Linton Blair for £76,000, and that was it. They can't afford to fight another election.
On the second question, Andrew, just given disillusionment, is another party going to step up?
I think it's a very good question. Minor parties becoming major parties. You think, well, we've got some candidates, haven't we? The Green Party won a seat in Brighton Pavilion. there was some talk about whether UKIP or BNP could break through, and they'd done well in the European Parliament elections, but could they break through in the first order election? As it turned out, no, they couldn't. But I think if we look across European politics more generally, what are the issues that seem to be representative of disillusion, discontent among some sections of the electorate? Issues like immigration, European integration. And I think there's we look across Europe, we see that does seem to generate quite a lot of, around those issues, a lot of discontent with politicians, the political system. There's complications there about cause and effect, but I think there's something real and significant there. But in relation to your question, whether a minor party becomes a major, I think a minor party could become relevant. You don't need a lot of votes in a system where you might become pivotal. You might be able to enter into coalitions at local level or at national level. I think it's the point at which minor parties become relevant in a context of political system that's more fragmented. And again, we can look in other European countries and see how that's happened. Look at the Dutch elections recently and see the political earthquake that has occurred there. Now, it's a very different country, a very different electoral system. But around certain kinds of issues, certain kinds of mobilisations, disillusion with politics, parties can become relevant and begin to play a more significant role in our politics. And we have candidates for that.